There's a fine line between art and obsession, between creating a statement and becoming one. This story comes from a documentary filmmaker named Maya, who went to Detroit's famous Heidelberg Street to ask one simple question: why was one house left out? And the answer she found was a masterpiece of terror. If you think you know what hides in the shadows of abandoned places, you're about to learn how wrong you are. Subscribe, because the truth doesn't always want to be filmed. This account comes from Maya. She was drawn to the Heidelberg Project, that famous stretch of abandoned houses turned into a vibrant, chaotic outdoor art installation. But her focus wasn't on the colorful polka dots and stuffed animals. It was on the one house at the end of the block that was conspicuously bare. No paint, no sculptures, just rotting wood and dark, vacant windows. The locals she interviewed wouldn't talk about it. They'd just shake their heads and look away. Her first day inside was a violation. The air was thick and still, heavy with the smell of old plaster, dust, and beneath it, a faint, sweet odor she couldn't place. The main floor was empty, but it didn't feel abandoned. It felt staged. A single wooden chair sat perfectly centered in the middle of the living room, facing a wall stained with water damage that looked unnervingly like a screaming face. She filmed everything, her narrator's voice calm and analytical, explaining the psychology of urban decay. It was a false calm, a professional shield against the primal unease coiling in her gut. But here's where it gets really disturbing. She found the basement door. It was unlocked, which was her first clue that something was wrong. The stairs groaned under her weight, descending into a deeper, colder darkness. Her camera light flicked on, and what it revealed made her gasp. This was the real gallery. The walls were lined with installations. A child's bicycle frame was meticulously woven with what looked like long, dark human hair. A collection of glass jars held what she desperately tried to convince herself were animal bones, arranged in delicate spiral patterns. But then the light caught a specific jar. Inside, floating in murky fluid, was a human finger, a tarnished silver class ring still clinging to it. What she found next will haunt you. Her research into missing persons reports became an obsession. She cross-referenced dates, descriptions. The class ring matched a teenager who vanished in 1994. The pattern of the hair matched a woman reported missing in 1998. This wasn't random decay. This was a curated collection. The house wasn't excluded from the art project by accident. It was excluded because it already had a curator. The truth was far worse than she imagined. On her third visit, she noticed something new. A small porcelain doll had appeared on the basement floor. It wasn't there before. Its head was turned to look directly at the stairs. As she focused her camera on it, a floorboard creaked directly above her. She wasn't alone. She shut off her light and froze, listening to the slow, deliberate footsteps pacing the main floor. They stopped right above the basement door. The doorknob began to turn, slowly, silently. She hid behind a support beam, her heart hammering against her ribs. A figure descended the stairs. It was a man, gaunt and hunched, dressed in filthy, paint-stained clothes. He hummed tuneless, discordant melody as he walked to his workbench, picking up a pair of rusted pliers. He didn't seem to notice her. He was entirely focused on his work, on adding to his collection. He was the excluded artist, and he was still working, finding his materials in the lost and the forgotten. Maya didn't breathe until he shuffled back upstairs an hour later. She waited in the freezing dark for what felt like an eternity before she dared to move. She fled, leaving her tripod behind. She never finished the documentary. The raw footage is locked in a safe, but sometimes she'll get a notification from her cloud storage. A file have been accessed from an unknown device. And when she checks it, it's a clip she never filmed. A shaky, first-person view of someone walking through that dark house, heading for the basement, with her own terrified face reflected in a split second in a dusty window pane. The curator isn't finished. He's just found a new subject, and he's already storyboarding his next piece. We build monuments to our own grandeur, believing they will stand as testaments to our legacy. But in Detroit's Brush Park, the Gilded Age mansions don't just hold memories, they hold time itself. And some are not content to be mere museums. This account comes from a property developer named Jake, a man who believed every problem had a price and every lock had a key. He learned that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. If you believe the past is a place you can walk away from, prepare to be trapped by this story. Subscribe, because time is not on your side. This account comes from Jake. He was a pragmatist, a man who saw Detroit's ruins not as tragic relics, but as spreadsheets waiting to be balanced. His latest project was a Queen Anne Victorian in Brush Park, a crumbling masterpiece of turrets and gingerbread trim. Its allure wasn't just architectural, it was legal. The house had no official ownership records for over 50 years. It was a ghost in the city's database, and Jake saw a blank check. The first time he pushed open the heavy oak front door, the air that washed over him was wrong. It wasn't the dry, dusty stillness of a long-abandoned place. It was thick, cool, and carried a scent that stopped him in his tracks. The faint, cloying aroma of roasting meat and old perfume. It vanished after a second, but the impression lingered, a phantom smell that set his nerves on edge. He dismissed it. A dead animal in the walls, his mind playing tricks. His business partner, Liam, refused to even step inside, mumbling about bad vibes. He just laughed it off, calling him superstitious. His initial survey was a catalog of contradictions. The grandeur was undeniable. Intricate parquet flooring, a carved mahogany staircase, stained glass windows depicting pastoral scenes. But here's where it gets really disturbing. In the grand foyer, beneath a layer of grime, he found a modern plastic pen. Not just any pen, a logoed one from a real estate firm that had gone out of business in the 1990s. He pocketed it, rationalizing that a squatter must have dropped it. But the next day, in a second-floor bedroom, he found a smartphone. The screen was shattered, and the battery was dead, but it was a model less than 5 years old. It felt cold, as if it had been sitting in a freezer. He returned the following week with a team of architects. What they found next will haunt you. The blueprints they had were useless. According to the plans, the library should have been to the left of the main staircase. Instead, they found a small, windowless sewing room. A wall where a fireplace was supposed to be was now a bank of cabinets. The team was baffled, blaming faulty archival records. But Jake felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He remembered the layout perfectly from his last visit. The house was different. It had shifted. That night, he went back alone, determined to prove to himself that he was just tired, that his mind was exaggerating. He entered the master bedroom, a vast space with a panoramic view of the decaying city through its bay window. He set his digital voice recorder on the mantel to document ambient noise and decided to wait, to just sit and observe. The truth was far worse than he imagined. He checked his watch after what felt like 20 minutes. Only 2 minutes had passed. His heart began to thud. He stood up, feeling dizzy. The air grew heavier, the phantom smell of perfume returning, stronger now. He heard it then, the faint, crystalline sound of a music box playing a tune he didn't recognize, coming from somewhere deep within the house. He grabbed his recorder to leave, but his hand froze. The digital display wasn't showing the correct time. It was rolling backwards, the numbers flickering rapidly, settling on a date, December 4th, 1967. Panic seized him. He bolted for the stairs, but the hallway seemed longer, the patterns in the wallpaper writhing in his peripheral vision. He stumbled into the foyer, yanking at the front door. It was locked. The heavy deadbolt, which he knew he'd left disengaged, was now thrown shut. He fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. That's when he saw her, a reflection in the darkened glass of the entryway mirror. A woman in a 1960s-style dress, standing on the staircase behind him, her face a mask of silent terror. He spun around. The staircase was empty. He finally got the door open and burst out into the night, gasping. He looked at his phone. He had been inside for over 6 hours. He had lost an entire evening. This was the shattering of the false calm. This was no faulty wiring or squatter. The house was alive, and it was hungry for time. Driven by a mixture of terror and a developer's stubborn obsession, he delved into the city's darkest archives. He uncovered the cover-up. The original family, the Thorntons, hadn't just moved away in 1967. There had been a murder-suicide. The father, in a fit of rage and despair, had killed his wife and 2 children before turning the gun on himself. The police report was buried, the story hushed up to protect the reputation of a prominent family. The house, it seemed, had never moved on from that night. His final visit was a descent into hell. He had to know. He had to understand. He brought supplies, extra batteries, a watch, and a desperate plan to mark his path with string. It was a futile gesture. The moment the door closed behind him, the house reacted. The music box melody swelled, now accompanied by the sound of a man shouting and a child sobbing. The walls seemed to pulse. He ran to the master bedroom, but it was now a nursery, a bloody handprint smeared across the wallpaper. He turned to flee and found himself in the basement, a place he had never been able to locate before. In the center of the concrete floor lay 4 chalk outlines, faded with time, but unmistakable. He was trapped in the temporal loop, forced to witness the house's ground zero trauma. The sounds became a deafening crescendo, a gunshot, then another, and another, and a final, solitary blast that echoed with a terrible finality. And then silence. In that silence, he saw them. Flickering at the edges of the room were the Thorntons, not as ghosts, but as moments, trapped in the eternal recurrence of their final seconds. And they were not alone. He saw the man with the 1990s pen, his face frozen in a scream. He saw the owner of the smartphone huddled in a corner. The house wasn't just replaying one tragedy. It was collecting participants for its endless performance. Jake never filed the permits. He sold his company and left the state. Liam found the ball of string, still tied to the front porch railing, the rest of it leading into the house, but severed cleanly, as if cut by scissors. Jake lives in a small, new-build apartment now, surrounded by white walls and silence. He keeps all his clocks synchronized to the atomic time signal. But sometimes, in the dead of night, he'll wake up to the faint, sweet smell of perfume, and his watch, no matter how new, will always, always lose time.
We all hear the stories of the people society leaves behind, but we never stop to ask where they actually go. This account comes from a social worker named Elena, a woman who dedicated her life to helping Detroit's most vulnerable. She followed a trail of missing souls into a place where charity became a curse, and where the city's industrial past isn't just a memory, it's a hungry, eternal engine. If you believe in helping your fellow man, you're about to discover a horrifying twist on that noble impulse. Subscribe, because some assembly lines never stop running. This account comes from Elena. For years, she managed to shelter just outside Corktown, and she knew the rhythms of the streets. Lately, however, a new unsettling pattern had emerged. Men and women she'd checked in on for years, veterans of the concrete and cold, were vanishing. Not just moving on, but disappearing without a trace. The whispers among those left behind always circled back to the same place, a crumbling 3-story boarding house on a forgotten street, a place that supposedly offered a warm bed and hot meal, no questions asked. Elena wasn't a detective, but her heart was a compass pointed toward the lost. She decided to see for herself. The house was a hulking shadow of red brick, its windows boarded up with rotting plywood. The front door, however, was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she was hit not by the expected stench of decay, but by a bizarre, layered smell. Beneath the expected notes of mildew and urine was the sharp, metallic scent of machine oil and the faint, comforting aroma of fresh baked bread. It was a sensory contradiction that set her instincts screaming. She told herself it was just the ghosts of the building's past. It had, after all, housed auto workers in the 1950s. This was the false calm, the logical mind building a dam against a flood of the impossible. The interior was a time capsule, but one curated by a madman. The lobby was furnished with threadbare couches from the 70s, while a dusty television from the 80s sat silent in the corner. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Upstairs, the bedrooms were not just abandoned, they were preserved. One looked like a worker had just stepped out, a 1950s-era lunch pail sitting open on a dresser, a petrified sandwich inside. In another, a room was frozen in the 1980s, a members-only jacket slung over a chair. It wasn't just the people had lived here. It was as if they had been collected. She met a man named Leo on the second-floor landing, a haggard man with kind, tired eyes, who said he'd been there for a week. "They give you a job downstairs," he told her, his voice a low rumble. "In the basement. Good work, steady. Helps you earn your keep." When she asked what kind of work, his eyes went distant. "Assembly," he said simply. "Always assembly." Then he shuffled away, his movements oddly stiff, as if his joints were already rusting. What she discovered next will haunt you. Driven by a growing dread, Elena returned that night. The house was no longer silent. From the basement came a sound that was utterly impossible, the relentless rhythmic cacophony of a factory in full swing, the heavy thump of a press, the shrieking whir of a grinding wheel, the clatter of a conveyor belt. It was the phantom soundtrack of Detroit's industrial soul, and it was coming from a basement that city records showed was only a coal cellar. She crept down the narrow staircase, the industrial symphony growing deafening. The truth was far worse than she had imagined. The basement was not a basement. It was a vast, cavernous space that stretched far beyond the house's foundations, lit by the hellish orange glow of phantom furnaces. And in that gloom, she saw them. Dozens of figures moved in the semi-darkness, their forms flickering between the solid and the spectral. She saw men in the 1950s coveralls, their faces smudged with grease that never wiped away. She saw the woman from the 80s room, now wearing safety goggles and feeding parts into a machine that wasn't there. And among them, she saw Leo, and others she'd recognized from the streets, their movements becoming more mechanical, their expressions blanker with each passing moment. They were building something. An endless, shifting assembly of metal parts that never formed a whole machine, their labor and eternal, pointless penance. This was no shelter. It was a recruitment center. The dead auto workers trapped by the accidents that had killed them decades ago weren't resting. They were fulfilling a perpetual production quota, and they were using the lost and forgotten of the modern era to replace their own ranks, to take their place on the line for all eternity. Elena stumbled back, her heart pounding, but the sound of a wrench hitting the concrete floor made her freeze. Every head in the basement, living and dead, turned in unison to look at her. There was no malice in their eyes, only a vacant, desperate need. They were short-handed. They saw her, a capable, compassionate soul, as the perfect foreman for their damned operation. She ran, bursting out into the blessed silence of the night. She called the police, but when they arrived, the house was silent and dark. The basement was just a small, empty room filled with trash. They didn't believe her. Elena quit her job. She can't walk past a construction site without flinching at the sound of pneumatic drills. But the worst part is the guilt. She still walks the streets sometimes, looking for the lost. And when she offers them a sandwich, a coffee, a real shelter, some of them just shake their heads with that same distant look Leo had. "No thanks, ma'am. I've got a steady job. Good work." Down in the basement. And she watches them walk away, knowing exactly where they're going, and that she is powerless to stop them from clocking in for a shift that never, ever ends. Every city has a wound that never heals, a place where the darkness doesn't just hide,
but festers. For Detroit, that scar is 8 Mile. This final account comes from a retired detective named Carmen Reyes, a woman who thought she had left the ghosts of her career behind. She learned that some cases never close because the evidence isn't just filed away, it's still collecting. If you think you can outrun your past, you need to hear this. Subscribe, because justice isn't always the goal. Sometimes, it's just another piece of the puzzle. This account comes from Carmen, 20 years on the force, and the one case that haunted her was the disappearance of her partner, Frank, during a botched raid on a crack house on 8 Mile in 2003. He vanished without a trace. No body, no goodbye. The official report called it a presumed desertion under fire, but Carmen never bought it. Frank was a good cop. In retirement, with nothing but time and regret, she found herself drawn back to the specific sagging house where it all went wrong. It was still standing, a monument to urban decay, its windows like dead eyes. The first time she pushed through the broken door, the smell hit her like a physical blow. A cocktail of stale urine, mold, and beneath it, the faint, sweet, acrid scent of old crack smoke, a ghost from 2 decades past. The floor was littered with needles and trash, but her trained eye immediately caught the anomalies. Amidst the modern detritus, a pristine evidence bag from the early 2000s lay on a rotting couch, its red seal unbroken. Inside was a knife she recognized from a 2005 stabbing, a case that had gone cold due to lack of evidence. Her mind raced, trying to find a logical threat. Had some corrupt cop used this place as a drop? It was a desperate false calm, a cop's mind trying to fit the impossible into a procedural box. She returned the next day with a powerful flashlight and a growing, sickening curiosity. The living room was a gallery of horrors. What she found next will haunt you. Tacked to the wall was a faded Polaroid of a missing girl from 1998. Next to it, hanging from a nail by its chain, was the badge of a missing persons detective who had vanished in 2010 while investigating the very same case. The house wasn't just a dumping ground. It was a perverse trophy room, a living archive of the city's failures, and it was showing her its collection. The truth was far worse than she imagined. In the kitchen, she found a current, half-smoked joint next to a vintage crack pipe, as if users from different eras were sharing the space. She heard it then, a low, mumbled conversation from the basement. She drew her retired service weapon, her heart a trip hammer in her chest, and descended the stairs. The basement was the heart of it all. The walls were papered with case files, evidence tags, and photos of victims spanning 30 years, and in the center of the room, sitting at a makeshift table from a door, was a man. His back was to her, his frame gaunt, his hair long and matted. He was sorting through a box of personal effects, wallets, watches, a child's hair ribbon. "Frank?" she whispered, her voice cracking. He turned slowly. It was him, but it wasn't. His face was 20 years older, etched with a madness that hadn't been there before. His eyes, once sharp and kind, were hollow. "Carmen," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "You're just in time. I was running out of space for the new acquisitions." He wasn't a prisoner. He was the curator. The house, he explained in a chillingly calm monotone, was more than a crack den. It was a nexus, a place that called to the lost and the wicked, and it had called to him that night in 2003. It showed him its purpose, to collect the evidence of the city's pain, to preserve the stories that the courts had failed to close. The missing persons, the cold cases, their energy, their unresolved narratives were the currency here, and Frank had become its chief archivist, luring in other investigators who got too close, adding them to the collection to help him with his eternal, damning work. "You always were the best partner I ever had," he said, taking a step toward her, his hand outstretched. "We can finish this together. We can finally bring all the evidence to light." Carmen didn't hesitate. She ran. She didn't look back. She heard him call her name once, not in anger, but with a profound disappointment. She never reported it. Who would believe her? She lives with the knowledge that the city's greatest cold case file is still actively being curated. She keeps her own case notes in Frank's old service photo locked in a box, but sometimes she'll wake up in the middle of the night convinced she smells old crack smoke and dust. And on her doorstep, she once found a single unsealed evidence bag. Inside was the pen she had lost in that house during her first visit. The case is still open, the collector is still adding to his files, and Carmen knows with a detective's cold certainty that her file is already down there, waiting for the final piece of evidence to be placed beside it. Her.